If you've ever felt too old for one world and too young for another, there's probably a reason for that. You remember life before everything became instant, before people were always reachable, before identity became something you performed, before adulthood started feeling like a moving target. And yet, you also had to adapt to all of it. You learned the internet. You learned speed. You learned how to function in a world that changed while you were still trying to understand who you were. That's the strange psychology of Xennials, because being an in-between generation is not just about when you were born. It's about what your mind was shaped by and what your adult life demanded from you later. Xennials grew up with one emotional rhythm and entered adulthood in another. That changes people. It creates a kind of personality that often looks calm on the outside, but internally feels split between two completely different versions of normal. And a lot of people living this way don't even realize how much it shaped them. Because it doesn't always show up dramatically. Sometimes it shows up in small things, like feeling tired by constant communication, like wanting privacy in a world that keeps asking for visibility, like understanding new technology, but still not feeling at home inside a life built around screens, like being able to adapt to almost anything, but never fully relax into what you adapted to. That's one of the first major Xennial patterns. They often look flexible, but a lot of that flexibility was learned under pressure. They didn't just witness change, they had to psychologically keep up with it. And those are two very different things. It's one thing to see the world evolve. It's another thing to build your identity while the rules are changing underneath you. That creates a strange kind of internal tension, because part of you still remembers a world with more silence, more waiting, more distance between people, more room to disappear and simply exist. But the world you live in now often rewards the opposite: constant responsiveness, constant updates, constant exposure, constant adaptation. So many Xennials carry two instincts at the same time. One part wants calm, simplicity, and emotional space. Another part has been trained to keep up, stay updated, and not fall behind. And when those two instincts live inside the same person for years, it creates exhaustion that is hard to explain. Not dramatic burnout, something quieter, a feeling that modern life is just slightly too loud, slightly too fast, slightly too demanding of your attention. And here's what makes this psychologically interesting. A lot of people assume Xennials are just nostalgic, but nostalgia is not the real story. The deeper story is a nervous system contrast. If you spent your early years in a slower world, your brain learned a different pace of life, a different rhythm of waiting, a different rhythm of boredom, a different rhythm of social connection. Then the culture changed, fast. Suddenly everything became immediate. And for a lot of Xennials, modern life did not simply feel more advanced, it felt more intrusive. Not because they are weak, not because they can't adapt, but because they remember what mental space used to feel like before constant interruption became normal. That memory changes how the present feels. It's also why many Xennials have a complicated relationship with technology. They can use it, work with it, depend on it, even appreciate it, but often they don't trust it emotionally. They may not say that directly, but it shows up in how they hesitate before oversharing, in how they value privacy more than younger generations often do, in how they sometimes resist turning every thought, feeling, or moment into public content. Because for many Xennials, privacy does not feel like hiding. It feels like dignity. It feels like having an inner life that doesn't need to be displayed to be real. And that creates another in-between pattern. Xennials usually understand the culture of visibility, but they don't always feel natural inside it. They understand social media, but they often don't fully belong to the emotional logic behind it. The idea that you should always be seen, always be building an identity, always be curating yourself in public. A lot of Xennials can do that if needed, but many never fully emotionally bonded with it. And that matters, because when a person knows how to perform a system without fully believing in it, they often live with quiet detachment. They participate, but with one foot out. And that pattern shows up in more than technology. It often appears in relationships too. Many Xennials were raised around emotional mixed signals. Be strong but caring, independent but available, responsible but not too emotional. mature, but low maintenance. So a lot of them learned early how to manage themselves, how to not take up too much space, how to handle things quietly, how to downplay emotional needs, how to be reliable without asking for much back. From the outside, that can look like stability, but sometimes it's actually emotional self-containment, a pattern built not from confidence, but from adaptation. And this is where it gets deeper. A lot of Xennials are not just between generations. They are between emotional systems. They grew up close enough to older values like restraint, toughness, and privacy, but lived long enough inside newer values like vulnerability, openness, and emotional language. So many of them understand both. They may believe in emotional honesty, but still feel exposed when things get too personal. They may want closeness, but also need strong internal space. They may be sensitive, but uncomfortable with too much emotional display. That contradiction confuses a lot of people, even themselves, because they don't feel fully emotionally closed, but they also don't feel fully emotionally open in the modern sense. They live in the middle, and living in the middle shapes identity. It can make a person thoughtful, observant, and emotionally intelligent, but it can also make them hard to categorize. Too private for one world, too aware for another, too adaptable to fall apart, but too internally divided to feel fully settled. And here's another pattern that often shows up in Xennials. They can carry a quiet pressure to be more together than they actually feel, because many were raised with a more linear model of adulthood. Work hard, grow up, become stable, reach a point where life starts making sense. But by the time they entered adulthood, that structure had already shifted. Careers changed, culture changed, money changed, relationships changed. Technology changed how people worked, connected, compared, and even thought. So a lot of Xennials ended up with an old emotional blueprint inside a new kind of reality. And that creates a very specific frustration. Because when your inner expectations were shaped by one kind of world, but your adult life happens in another, you can start feeling behind for reasons that are not fully personal. That's important, because some of the pressure Xennials carry is not about personal failure. It's about historical mismatch. They were trying to become adults during a period when adulthood itself was being rewritten, and that leaves marks. It often creates people who are capable, responsible, and resilient, but inwardly still feel like they never landed, like they learned how to function, but not how to feel fully at home in the world they were asked to function inside. That's why so many Xennials seem grounded and restless at the same time. They often know how to deal with life, but deep down, many still feel like life became something stranger and more demanding than what they were emotionally prepared for. And because they usually don't dramatize this, it often goes unnoticed. They just keep going. They keep adapting. They keep managing. They keep translating between worlds. And that may be the real psychological core of being a Xennial. Not just remembering two eras, but becoming a translator between them, between analog and digital, between privacy and visibility, between emotional restraint and emotional openness, between the old idea of adulthood and the unstable reality of modern life. That role sounds small, but psychologically it's heavy, because people who spend their lives translating often become deeply perceptive. They notice what changed. They notice what got lost. They notice what became harder to explain. They can often read both older and younger generations fairly well, while quietly feeling that neither one fully explains them. And that creates a subtle loneliness, not always social loneliness, interpretive loneliness. The feeling of living with an internal experience that doesn't fit neatly into the language around you. You understand both worlds, but you don't completely belong to either one. And once you see that, a lot of Xennial behavior starts to make more sense. The skepticism, the quiet resilience, the dislike of unnecessary performance, the need for privacy, the ability to adapt without loving what they adapted to, the calm exterior covering a more complicated internal adjustment. None of that was random. It was the psychology of being shaped in transition, of being raised by one world and used by another, of learning stability early, then living through instability later. And that does something to identity. It makes people observant, layered, self-contained, emotionally careful, and often much more affected by cultural change than they look. Because not every generation feels change the same way. Some are born inside it, others have to translate themselves through it. Xennials were the translators. And once you understand that, the in-between generation stops sounding vague. It becomes something much more real. A psychological pattern. A pattern of people who were never simply between years, but between ways of living, ways of relating, ways of coping, and ways of being seen. Once you see it, you can't really unsee it. It was never just a label, it was a nervous system position, and that explains more than most people realize.